Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the head of marketing at Infotools. Today, we're joined by John Van Vleck, founder of the Greenroom Collective, where he helps Fortune 500 companies in 5 continents solve pressing business challenges and opportunities. Prior to founding the collective, John was Director of Insights, Ideas and Creativity at Coca-Cola. Today, his mission is to help businesses think differently to cultivate new possibilities by matching the collective genius of internal teams with fresh perspectives from the outside world. Thanks for joining us on the show, John.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here.
So let's start off with one of the things we always do by asking, what's the most significant thing you wanted to share with us today?
There's really 2 things, and I'm going to preface it for all your listeners out there. This is my perspective as someone whose job it is to help businesses think differently and generate actionable solutions. That said, so I'm coming from that perspective, but that said, insights are a huge part of how we do what we do. So it's something that's important for us, and we see insights as inspiration for ideas. So just keep that in mind for your listeners as we go forward. But 2 things really. One is just how do we blend the science of research with the art of insight? And how do we blend those things together to build more compelling narratives, storylines, to take us through to wherever it is we're trying to get to in our creative thinking, in our innovative thinking, and just pushing the boundaries of what we're trying to accomplish. And I say that, I bring that up because it's in the work that we do, it's often the researchers who feel most uncomfortable with our approach. So it's something that I just wanted to talk about because we sometimes take very unconventional approaches to the way we do research-like things, but it's because of our intention to get to creativity and to unlock something that hadn't been seen before. And the second really is related, and it comes down to kind of what is the role that insights and research can play? What do we want it to play? There's so much more to research than what I typically think of as almost rear view mirror, which is either surveying the land of what is going on or validating, a piece of copy or those sorts of things. But how can we think of research more forward thinking and more exploratory, so that we're constantly breaking new grounds, not necessarily in the research, but in how we apply research. So those are my 2 big things.
Yes, some very interesting, correlations between the role of the researcher and the potential role of AI as well. We want to be getting out in front of all of that stuff, don't we, to help in that green space, the green room.
Exactly. And, it's interesting. I know we're going to talk about it a little bit later, and maybe I didn't mention it, but one of the things is I've sat in research departments almost my entire career, and you're relegated to a kind of a support role. And as a supporting act, you're not always in the spotlight, and you're not always invited to the big meetings. And so to me, there's too much value in research and insights not to be at those meetings. So how can the function be at those meetings and add values in way beyond just delivering findings?
That's right. Well, looking forward to getting into some of that. But first, let's just have a little step back and a reflective retrospective on your career journey and how you came up with the idea of the Greenroom Collective.
Sure. So I will say so far, it's been a long journey. And I go back to the world of advertising in New York City, late 1980s, at a time when research, and I sat in the research department there, when the research department was really an extension of the client. And you would do segmentation studies, U&As, you would field the work for them. you would be their arm. You were their partner. And then over time, the role of research in the US in advertising anyway kind of evolved from more research focused to what they called planning, which was really about connecting the dots between everything that you're learning to inform creative development and that process. So not only were you doing research and the methodology, but you became the owner of the creative brief. And so you were then taking what you were learning and writing it and distilling it into a way in which would launch creative. And so that was a big shift in mindset for me, a different kind of way of looking at what I was doing. And then from there, I ended up at Coca-Cola, basically being one of the first planners in their global advertising department, doing essentially the same thing I was doing agency side, but now working with the agencies on the other side of the fence, helping them, writing briefs for them that hopefully would help them better unlock where we were trying to get to. And over time, one thing led to another. And, I did everything from brand management to macro forces and trends, and then found myself in this role in this group within the research department called Innovation Igniter, which is where the insights, ideas, and creativity title came from. But really for us, it was a form of design thinking, which was, how do you shift the perspective? Because in business, we are so inward out. We're always looking from our perspective outward to the business. How do we shift that perspective and try to see our business from the perspective of the consumer? I say it was a form of design thinking because we didn't really know anything about design thinking then. It was just a process that we got trained in. And we also infused it with a bit of lateral thinking and creativity to kind of help unlock minds even further. Because the one thing that Coke realized was it didn't know how to have ideas. And so that was part of the journey, was to help the company and the business units and regions around the world. They would come to us and we would help, we devise and design a plan to help them kind of unlock creativity on their pressing business challenges. Left Coke in about 2015 after 13 years and formed the Greenroom Collective. And with the belief and the mindset, wow, insights can be a great catalyst for ideas. And, doing all the work that we did at Coke throughout the system with many different of its customers, from Walmart to Target to McDonald's and you name it, we've done it. We've just had a lot of experience to bring to the outside world where we thought they could benefit from the approach that we were taking.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I'm just my earlier on in my career was actually in advertising as well. So from a creative perspective as well, and just I really love the merging of these two things, and just seeing so much more now of the value of those insights, and particularly when they do come from a research-based
Yes,
perspective as well.
I totally agree. I think there are people in advertising right now who have no research foundation, and it's a shame because, in the work that we do, research is the foundation of where we begin. And without it, everything becomes more subjective. But it becomes one end of the story. It's the beginning of the story and the place where you can then use it to be your compass and your guide to tell you, okay, what do we know from the research? What do we still want to know? And then design programs around how do we get at those questions that we still want to answer. And the research as a foundation also gives you confidence about where you're looking. Are our areas of focus the right areas of focus? Because otherwise you're just shooting in the dark. And when you get to an idea, if it's anchored all the way back into the research and grounded in that, and you have an iterative process along the way that takes you from the foundation to the idea, now you've got a narrative and a story to tell. And that can be very powerful, and that makes that idea less subjective. unless as a, a fledgling on its own, and it gives it some meat and some weight and some confidence in which to kind of view the idea, because you
Yeah,
know where it came from.
absolutely. And you know that it's going to connect with people as well because it is representative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we use some techniques along the way that might not be as representative, but we're using them. It's research like in the approach, but we're using it for stimulus, for ideas, not only for the representation piece, because we know at the end of the day that idea will be tested,
Yes.
that idea will be validated, and when an idea is validated, the insight is often validated as well. So
Very true. So I guess it's a good segue. Can you share an example from your career where you've taken that unconventional or creative approach, as we've just talked about, and unlocked a powerful insight?
sure. A couple, could I do two?
Go for it.
Because they're very different. We were working with a medical device company on contact lenses to try to build their innovation pipeline. And, we had mined the research, we had looked for areas of focus. And this is where it gets a little bit unconventional from an insight standpoint. But we brought a team together, R&D, research and engineer, the marketing people, all gathered them together. And one of the people that we brought in to speak, to be interviewed actually, was an alligator wrangler. And you think, well, what does an alligator have to do with anything that they're working on? Except that somewhere along the line, one of us had heard that an alligator has this additional membrane that covers its eye when it's submerged in water, so it can see and that debris doesn't get into it, much like a contact lens. So the alligator wrangler came in and he brought an alligator, mouth, not a croc, but an alligator, mouth taped shut with the smallest piece of tape I could ever imagine. But one of the engineers noticed in the course of the interview with this man that the alligator hadn't blinked, and the engineer asked, so how is that possible? I've been here for 15 minutes and the alligator hasn't blinked once. And he said, well, it's the chemical properties in the eye. And so that they had always thought about the biology of the eye. They weren't thinking about the chemical property of the eye. And so it just got them thinking in a very different way about a real problem that their consumers face, which is dry eye. If you're a contact user, you know that dry eye can be, a painful, awful thing. And so it got them to think differently. Now, that wasn't a insight that would have come from any of the data that they had, but it was a way of getting them to think outside of their everyday. And I just want to add, like, our process is based on, there's the godfather of creative thinking is a guy by the name of Edward de Bono. And he had this concept of streams of recognition or rivers of thinking, which was essentially, as we get more into our routines, and as we start doing things more and more the same ways all the time, it becomes harder to come up with something new because you have all these experiences saying this, dictating how you should do it. So part of what we're trying to do with our clients is to get them out of that box, if you will, to river jump and to see things from a different light and to take in different stimulus from which then they create against. And that alligator was one example of that, which was just fascinating because we had no idea at the time if it would work or if it wouldn't work, but we knew that it would get people's attention, right? And get them to lean in. But it worked, and it got them to think very differently about how they were going to approach their mission and their objective. The second was we were working on a project for aiming a beverage at children through their parents. And this was in Istanbul, Turkey, beautiful city, known for their rugs. Beautiful Turkish rugs. One of the people, again, we brought in to help kind of just get us to think a little bit differently was a carpet salesman. And he came in with a $10,000, rug under his arm. And the first thing he did, I don't know if you've been to Turkey, but they're very, they're very good salespeople. But he came in and the first thing he did was shook everybody's hand and he asked their name and he made it. So principle number one, make it personal, right? Like, so he started learning and then he, rolled the rug and started talking about the story that the rug was telling on it and, the different symbols and the meaning. So again, the importance of storytelling. On the rug was a certificate of authenticity, right? Which, if you think about a product that a parent is going to buy for their child, they're going to want to know that it comes from a reputable place. So how, again, another principle that you could steal and borrow from. All marketing 101, but a very good reminder coming from outside in a different category, in a different world, that all these principles still have a place and it's good to go back to and visit. So again, how do we make it personal? How do we tell a good story about our product? How do we make it feel like for the parent that this is reputable and trustworthy, because we know those are going to be important things. So all those little insights became platforms from which we could have ideas against. Does that make sense?
It does.
So those would be two examples.
So when we think about this from then a research perspective, like we've often talked about and referred to research as being the science of,
Sure. Yeah.
I guess a science and an art as well.
Sure.
So in your experience, how can people find that sweet spot between sticking to the methodology and then embracing creativity?
Sure. I think one of the first things is just to recognize and acknowledge that there's a place for both, right? This, in my opinion, this isn't an either or. It's not about the art of insights or the science of research. You need both. There's a time and place for each. There are times when you want to explore, and there are times and be expansionist in your thinking. And there are times when you want to be reductionist and you want to be making decisions based on something that you know is valid and representative. And I think that's one, right? Just knowing that there is a place for both. And then the other thing is, I think, and I talked about this a moment ago, but just looking at the research as the foundation, right? That for us is the beginning of everything, because without it, everything becomes subjective and hearsay, if you will. We look at it almost like, what do we currently know? Like there's every company is sitting on reams and reams of data and research findings. That tells us what we know. But within that, if we look at the inverse of that, there are still things we want to know. And I think that's where you can find the creative aspect of research, is to, okay, we need to know what we need to know, but we're not going to learn everything. So then how can we take that and use the methods and the techniques that we've accrued over the years to kind of unlock those additional questions? So the art of it comes from asking ourselves, what do we still want to know, right? What do we know? What do we still want to know? And then trying to, and not being afraid necessarily to take some novel approaches with how you get at those insights. And that kind of goes to the second piece of the, what we're going to talk about today was, the role, which is how do you become a thought leader and provoke conversation? And sometimes that's going to come by, bringing an alligator wrangler into the room. It may not be traditional and it may not sit well with, some researchers, but there's value to that exploration too. And I think, with the background of researchers, you can still do that in a way that isn't too inflicted with bias or leading the horse, if you will.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it I would just add is what's the intention of what we're trying to do? So in the work that I do, the intention is, ideas and solutions. And that will not always be the case with a lot of research. A lot of times research is let's find out what's going on. And that's fine. It's just, but what is the intention? And in my world, we always like to design with the end in mind. What do we want it to look like at the end of the day? And I think just starting sometimes there, rather than what method are we going to use, where do we try to get to, and then figure out what's the right method to get there. Because I'll just add, we use a method too, to our madness. There is a method, there's a process, just like any researcher would take. It's just a slightly different method.
True. And ultimately, it's about generating understanding that can then be used.
Absolutely. So our intention, I remember we were doing a project for Coke in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And I got up and I was talking to them, and I always hesitate to say, we do something we call speed dating. We'll bring consumers in and we'll set them up at stations, and then we'll break the, client into small groups, and we'll literally do fast rotations we'll give them questions. They're free to ask their own questions. And the purpose is not to necessarily duplicate what already has been done. It's to hear consumers talk about things that we already know in their language or from their perspective, that then can become stimulus to help create against. And so, but I remember being up in front of the room, and this woman, a researcher, she said, it is research. It's just a different type of research. And I was like, well, thank you very much. But I was saying it the way I was saying it because I wanted people to understand the purpose of what we are doing is to create stimulus and to think with that in mind versus worrying about, we've got 8 consumers. Are they, is that a representative sample? Probably not. But you can get something from them. There's value to them anyway, just talking to them.
True.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, good.
So when we initially spoke, you referenced Steve Jobs' quote about creativity being simply connecting the dots. How do you see this applied in research when trying to move beyond data toward actionable insights?
Two things come to mind. One is, I think very often when we say research, at least in my mind, I'm thinking about a piece of research. And very often a piece of research will be shared, and the findings will be, shared with people, and conversations will ensue and all that good stuff. But there's also probably 10 other studies that could be taken together. So one is just connecting the dots is connecting all the different forms of research into a bigger picture and a more complete narrative. So that's one, is just thinking big picture. Like you might be doing this study, but how does it fit with what you're hearing in other places? And what story is it telling? And then the second piece is one great example, I think, of just connecting the dots was, and I didn't see this firsthand, but it was shared with me, was in a supermarket, a wine coupon being found in the diaper section, which at first glance you go, well, that's interesting, right? But then when you start thinking about it more deeply, you start going, well, that makes total sense, because a woman who has just given birth probably hasn't had a glass of wine in 9 months. And it's the sort of insight that somebody had and then applied creatively that probably wouldn't show up in a UNA study. It might have been spoken in a focus group or a one-on-one type of interview. But those are the sorts of insights that you can then play with and do something with. And so to me, whoever did that connected the dots, right? They make wine. Wine has no business really in the diaper section, but somebody figured out a connection and connected the dots in a way and said, you know what, a new mother or a mother of a newborn child, that's a pretty savvy place to put it.
Yeah, and it's not an alcohol wipe, is it? It's not quite that strong.
No, and it's just you think and you go, that's genius. That was pure. That was very clever, but it was a great use of an insight. And I think that's why also that's why the data is and the research is the foundation. But if you don't muck around a little bit and explore, other ways of talking to consumers or talking to the people who know those consumers really well. I think sometimes in research, we get stuck on talking to the same people all the time. And you can do a lot by talking around those people. Like, for example, if you're working with, something on teenagers, they're the worst to get anything out of. But if you talk to their older brother or sister, or you talk to their parents, or you talk to a coach, or you talk to a counselor or a teacher, you might get new insight into their world and how they think and how they behave and why they behave that way without ever talking to them. So that's what I for me, that's about connecting the dots, is looking holistically at what you have and trying to piece together the bigger picture and the bigger story.
No, it's a good approach. So I guess this is coming on to the second point now, around not becoming just order takers. So researchers not just following methodology for methodology's sake, but instead provoking those meaningful conversations and their insights.
One of the best piece of advice I got very early on in my advertising career was by it was a dog and cat food account, not the sexiest of things, but he said, the account supervisor said to me, if I can give you one piece of advice, it's like, understand your client's business, understand how they make money. And I think that is a huge piece of it. As a researcher, it's not what the research brings, it's what you bring to the research. And so if you can understand your client, and those clients could be external, they could be internal, but understanding how what you're doing fits into how they're trying to do things, I think that's when you start becoming more of an ally and less of an order taker, more of a partner and less an order taker. And then I think if you can start bringing value to the conversation, they won't be coming to you and say, hey, we need to do 9 groups, or we need to do this study. You'll be asking them, so what's your brief? What are you trying to accomplish? And then how does what I can do fit into where you're trying to get to? And then it becomes a partnership versus, being in service to all the time.
No, so there's a lot.
So what's that?
No, keep going.
Well, I was going to say, and just to give you an example, at Coke, you had the consumer, and they were the people who consumed the product. You had the shopper, who they're the people who bought. They weren't always the consumer. They might have bought it for their household. You had a bottler who, manufactured the product and got it onto shelves and did some localized marketing. You had a customer, the retailer whose shelves it appeared on. All those people have their own interests, needs, and wants. And I think the more you can start thinking about how are we delivering output that will be of value to them, I think it makes you become a better partner, right? And so they're more likely to listen to your approach if you spend the time up front saying, well, what are you trying to do and why? Because I can help you get there. Just give me the scope and the objective and what are we trying to accomplish and what does it need to look like in the end? Not to say, hey, we're going to do things to, compromise the method, but how can we add value to what you're trying to accomplish?
One of our former guests on the show talked about the change that happened when Coke moved away from glass bottles And some people don't realize, if because they haven't thought about it, just how heavy those glass bottles were, and then what that meant for distribution and pallets
Sure.
and like all of that stuff. There was some wider things at stake there. So really interesting from a
And just to build on that, an interesting insight. We were working on a project at Coke for packaging, 2030, right? And this was probably 2012, right? So packaging of the future, and everybody's thinking space age concepts and this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things that we arranged as part of the project was we sent teams out to have dinner in different parts of, we're in Amsterdam, so in different parts of Amsterdam. And I remember the family that I met and I had dinner with lived on a third floor apartment with the steepest, narrowest, staircase that I've ever been on. I mean, it was, and my initial thought was, how do you get anything up here? Right. So long story short, you start thinking, well, and people in Europe, they tend to shop every day. Right. And so you're going to have to make some choices about what you're going to lug up those stairs, those steep stairs, especially, after a long day of work or whatever, or put on a bike. So you're going to have to make choices. So what was really interesting for us is we were thinking way out 2030, but it came back, those buildings aren't going to change. And so an insight, the insight that you just, heaviness, right? Like weight and bulk were huge issues. So sometimes, you think forward thinking, but it grounds you in, okay, reality, right? So that was a great insight for us, which was, okay, how can we remove the bulk? How can we make it easier to get things in the apartment or in the house or whatever? So I just wanted to build on that because you sparked that thought as when you were speaking.
no, true, and it's the importance of connecting dots as well and having
Exactly.
conversations. So yeah.
Exactly.
So you mentioned before that that you're in the insights business rather than the research business. Can you explain what you mean by that distinction? I guess how insights professionals can reframe their work to focus more on the insight than the methodology.
So I think I mentioned earlier, we in my world, we define an insight as inspiration for an idea. It's kind of the holy grail of what we do. If we find a good insight, we know that an idea will leap out of that. But insights are a lot like ideas in the sense that they can come from anywhere, from anybody at any time. And so that's what I'm in pursuit of is the insight. I don't care where it comes from. I know down the road at some point that insight will either be validated or not through the idea that it generates. I don't need to do a research study to find an insight. And it's that's not a negative on research. It's just, but to me, it's where you're trying to get to. You're trying to get to a great insight. Research and the method is the means to get there, right? And so know what you're pursuing. And it could be that you're pursuing just validating the current state of affairs or understanding the current, that's fine. But that's your intention. And then you design to that. And so for me, we live and die on whether we have good insights or we get to good insights or not. And so when I say I'm in the insights business, I borrow so much from research and techniques and so forth. But my goal is less about the method and it's more about where does it take us? Does that make sense? And I think unfortunately research has often been relegated to the, just tell us the facts, right? And tell us what is. And I think it can be so much more forward thinking. And I know we talked about that a little bit before, but to me, the insight is the thing that gets you to the future. A finding is a finding, and it could be really important finding, but without the insight is the thing that's going to be the catalyst for an idea.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I liken, this is a strange analogy, but I liken, like when I think about quantitative research, I think of it's like a crime scene. It's the outline of the body, You know that something has taken place. You may know what happened to some degree, but very often you don't know the motivation, you don't know the backstory, you don't know the bigger context of what took place that led to what that happened. And I think a large part of what we try to do at the Greenroom Collective is get to that. What are the motivations? Why is something happening that has come out of the research as the what, right? Now we need to figure out the why and so what of that.
Yeah, and in a lot of senses, what AI is kind of wakening up people to, I guess, realize is that researchers have always had their fingers in data. They've always been comfortable with it, and in a lot of senses, they're best placed or really well placed to help organizations through, I guess, the mire that AI can cause as well, because there's a lot of data that they're swimming through that businesses are, and you need to make sense of that. And that's one thing that researchers have been doing since day dot.
Sure, and I think we did a project for a large search engine company, and it was all designed around how to help their UX people kind of get closer to their customers. And one of the things, and I don't think this would be a surprise to anyone, is that researchers, there's so much data now, and there's so little time
Yeah.
that it's hard to really do the analysis on everything that you want to do. And so, AI could be a really useful tool in a way to kind of help bridge that gap so that you can spend more time thinking about what it's coming up. And I think that's the thing. I just think that we need to think, right? We need to be out there, not just looking at what's being said and what's being reported, but what does it mean? And how can we take that meaning and apply it to the business at hand? And so I'm an introvert as someone who sat in a research department. So it's taken me a long time to get to the place where I'm like, well, no, we need to be a little bit liberated so that we are forward thinkers and forward, thought leaders.
Well, I can't remember the exact person, but the five whys or the
Right.
six whys or seven whys. Just
Right.
keep on asking
Yeah.
and drilling down.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, someone told me a long time ago that why is not a good question. It's what about? What is it about? But that's a tangent for another day, But the principle is right. Like laddering to the deeper meaning. And you got to scratch beneath the surface, right? Because what I find interesting about data is you could have 100 people answer a question the same way, but for 100 different reasons. And I think that I remember being doing a shop along with this woman, and she was sorry, someone was trying to call me, and she was I don't know, she was segmented as she met the profile of this very health conscious person, and in my head, in my biased head, I had her as a yoga mat carrying, sitting on the dock in the position. When I met her, she was anything but. And her husband had type 2 diabetes, and so she was very conscious about what food he got to eat, right? Because it was life or death, literally, for him. And so I think sometimes when we do studies, we get you get a nice picture that kind of in a name for a segment, but then is everybody really the same in that segment? Probably not. And I think that's where when you blend the foundational elements of solid research with let's do a little digging here, let's scratch beneath the surface, you can find some really interesting stories.
So we have talked a lot in the insight sector about getting a seat at the table. How can researchers elevate their function to become thought leaders within their organizations rather than just that support function that we talked about earlier?
I think, from my perspective and having sat inside a big company, people value good thinking no matter where you sit in an organization. And part of good thinking, and it goes back to something I said earlier about knowing your stakeholders, right? Knowing what their challenges are, what they're struggling with, knowing what success looks like for them. So that when you come with the research, you are thinking about how the research, what its meaning is relative to what they're doing. And to me, if you can do that versus just sharing, here are the findings, but now I'm going to tell you what it means for what you're doing or what I think it means. Let's have a conversation about it. I think more often than not, they're going to see value in that you're pushing their thinking. Now you're getting them to see things. One, they understand that you care about what they're doing. Empathy goes a long way, right? So not just for the consumer or whomever, but for your internal stakeholders or whomever they may be, is if you understand their business and what business they're in and can add value to that, you're going to get a seat at the table. I think when we get caught up in, we become protective of the methodology or the means, then we're seen as divisive or defensive, and potentially, divisive even at times. So again, it's trying to understand what their needs are and what value you can bring to them. And then the method will dictate, how you get there. So that would be my short answer. Because I think empathy goes a long way, right? So, and if you can add thought value to what they're trying to do, they're going to want you at the next meeting.
So answer a few of those whatabouts before you present.
Yeah. And one thing that we often do, we use this tool once we've had an idea. We'll often say, okay, let's list out all the stakeholders. What would their comment be about the key idea or the essence of the idea? What would their concerns be? What would they like? What would they hate? And I think as researchers, we can do that too, thinking about if our lead finding is, okay, how are they going to react to that? And just start thinking with the end in mind again. And how then you can, I'm not saying you change it, but you think about how you can express it in a way that becomes more palatable or more meaningful for what they're doing. Because that kind of anticipation, yes, we're supposed to represent, the consumer and fairly and objectively, and we need to do that. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about how it's going to be applied and used, and what some of the pushback might be and how to address it before it becomes pushback.
The old gatekeepers.
That's right. That's right. I mean, none of this is that, new, right? It's basically human relations.
Very true. I guess last question. If you could give one piece of advice, excuse me, one piece of advice to researchers who want to move from being seen as methodologists to insight-driven thought leaders, what would that be?
I think I just touched on it. It'd be empathy, right? Just, yes, you're a scientist in a way. You need to mind the craft of the research, but having empathy for everyone that surrounds it and leaning into, again, what their needs and wants are. Not saying that you're trying to fulfill their needs and wants, but understanding that what they want, I think goes a long way, because now you're an active listener versus a protector of a methodology or a pusher of information. But now you're an active listener who is concerned for their success. And I think that goes a long way.
But it's not just for internally speaking, is it? It's for our stakeholders, the participants, respondents, etc. too. The
Absolutely.
consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, one of the things I think that often gets lost is when we're doing, let's say, consumer research, is the greater context. If I took a group of clients to a store to visit their aisle, they will sit fixated looking at the aisle and their product on the shelf and their competitors, and they will, look at it admirably, right? Like, how wonderful is it? But there's a whole other store out there, right? And there's all sorts of other behaviors that are going on that while we think our products might be the center of the universe, our consumers don't. Rarely. So how do we understand the greater context in which our brands and products and our business lives in the greater context? What I think will give us a better understanding of how to speak to our consumers, how to relate to them, how to be more relevant. Again, it's that out to in perspective versus inward out. And I think, so to your point, having empathy for not just your questions, but the bigger context of their lives can shed insight into their behaviors that you're concerned about.
Mm. No, very true. Well, did you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share with us on these two before we close, John?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is we are in a brave new world, I think, over the last 15, 20 years, where we have more and more data. And I think more real-time pressure on data, or on business, I should say. So you have this influx of huge amounts of data, everybody looking for answers, and you have businesses under real stress to deliver. And I think in that is an opportunity for, and I'll just add, I mean, and the research that one company might have is probably not that different from the research that another company has. So everyone's kind of sitting on the same gold, if you will, mining the same information. So I think the question as I start thinking about the future is, what are we going to do differently to unlock new insights, new perspectives, new thinking, new ideas? Because if we're all sitting on the same stuff, we're likely to come to the same conclusions and the same implications and the same ideas. So I think the winners are going to be those who kind of embrace the ambiguity and take that data again as the foundation and think forward into, okay, what are we going to do? How can we do things a little bit differently? Maybe how can we look in a place where we haven't looked before for inspiration? I think those are going to be the people who come out as the winners. I think I just see that when I do the work with our clients is everybody is kind of thinking the same way because they have the same information. If we don't get new insights, we're not going to have new ideas and we're not going to add value to the business. So that would be my one kind of push towards the end is like, how can we maintain the confidence in what we do and the reliability, but at the same time, how can we dip a toe or two into uncomfortable waters and see what we can learn? And I know it's hard because budgets are tight and people will press you for the thing that has always worked. But if we don't start thinking about how we can use insights more actively, I think there's a danger that we just stay put in the status quo. My 2 cents.
Really nice. Embracing ambiguity.
Yes. In the innovative space and innovation space, if you don't embrace ambiguity, it will kill you.
And then unleash your curiosity within that as well, and you'll do well.
Yeah. I like to say, I think of this I hope this doesn't offend it. I think of research as a profession. I think of insights as a lifestyle. And you go to your job, you might do the research stuff, but I know for myself, my mind is always trying to connect things and work things out and watch and observe, even when I'm not working. And so in that way, you take that lifestyle of insights and, you're constantly going to be, coming up with assumptions and hypotheses and things that you can test. But that's me.
Very cool. Great words to finish on. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
It's been good to be with you and get to see you and talk with you. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Cool. Thank you also to those who have listened in today. If you have liked what you've heard, feel free to share this podcast with others. subscribe to the podcast, and leave a review as well. Would be very grateful. With that, thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.